What's on your radar today, Robby?
Well, the World Economic Forum's yearly meeting has come to an end, and the world's wealthy corporate elites and government leaders are heading back home to continue strategizing about how best to fight climate change. Never mind the 150-plus private jets they took to the conference in Davos. As we discussed last week, one of the central themes of this year's conference, in addition to climate change, was the supposed crisis of online disinformation, the failure of social media platforms to restrict false information and prevent the gullible masses from consuming it, was held up as the central problem for our times. Because how else can the authorities at Davos figure out how to move us around like chess pieces if we keep doing unexpected things because we're reading sources of information they don't approve of that clash with their preferred priorities and preferences? World Economic Forum leaders are fully committed to fighting the war in Ukraine for as long as it takes, and they can't have the people getting too upset about the food shortages and energy prices that are resulting from it. Former CNN anchor Brian Stelter hemmed a panel on disinformation in which a U.S. Democratic politician and the publisher of the New York Times discussed how best to weigh the trade-offs between your right to free speech and their need to shut you up. But it was the remarks by another panelist that most captured the internet's attention. This remark by European Commission member Vera Jourova went viral. Let's watch.
Well, we need the people who understand the language and the case law in the country. Because what qualifies as hate speech, as illegal hate speech, which you will have soon also in the US, I think that we have a strong reason why we have this in the criminal law.
In that clip, Jourova announces that she believes European-style hate speech laws, which criminalize transgressive and offensive political statements, will be coming to the U.S. Jourova is the European Union's Commissioner for Values and Transparency. You have to admit she's being fairly transparent about her values there. More recently, she also had this to say on the subject of Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter.
After Mr. Musk took over the Twitter with his freedom of speech absolutism, we are the protectors of freedom of speech as well. But at the same time, we cannot accept, for instance, the illegal content online and so on. So our message was clear. We have the rules which have to be complied with, and otherwise there will be sanctions.
Follow the rules or face the sanctions. That's the EU's message for Elon Musk. She also said the time of the Wild West is over and that social media companies must behave themselves so as not to cause harm. We know what the Davos authorities mean by harm. They mean scrutiny of Western governments' COVID policies. They mean open criticism of China's communist authoritarians and questions about whether China's lax lab safety protocols were responsible for the entire pandemic. They mean vocal opposition to the war in Ukraine. Any challenge to the resolve that they believe all democratic nations must show. In other words, they mean dissent. Thankfully, the U.S. is not part of the European Union, and we have a little thing called the First Amendment that ostensibly prohibits the federal government from censoring our words just because they might be provocative or controversial or not entirely agreed upon. Our federal government wishes, of course, that it had broad power to control our speech. Federal bureaucrats' constant pressuring of social media companies to moderate content is a worrisome example and shows how our government will always try to get around the First Amendment. Even so, Americans have a lot more protections than their European counterparts, at least for now. Make no mistake, the Davos enforcers have noticed that Elon Musk is offering, or at least promising, a more open and less regulated Twitter platform. They don't like it one bit.
Yeah, Robby, I mean, it's interesting. We had this kind of comparative law conversation on my podcast last week. We were talking about the controversy around Brazilian speech laws and some criticisms that Glenn Greenwald has been making, and then some criticisms he's been receiving as a consequence of perhaps critiquing Brazilian speech standards as though they are American speech standards. And even though I think that we're here all invested in our speech standards in the First Amendment and having a more, or let's say less restricted version of freedom of speech, it is in fact the case that other countries have made different kinds of decisions. And their laws are different, and their constitutions, to the extent that they have them, say different things. So I don't know. I think it is true, obviously, that other places like the EU or Brazil, they have more broad hate speech laws. They are restricted from saying certain things. My guest talking about Brazil was talking about how, racism was illegal, and it's a little difficult to wrap one's brain around. But then you think, well, we have restrictions on our own speech here with respect to, if you could call not being allowed to kick someone out of a restaurant because they're black, making racism illegal in the United States. I mean, we all live on some kind of a spectrum. And I guess my question is this. We live in a global society. We have these global corporations like Twitter. Is it really so nefarious? I mean, we don't have to like it. We don't like what other countries' rules are, but is it really nefarious for the EU to say a company operating in its country has to obey its speech laws, and the same for Brazil and the same for the United States of America, that we'll have fewer restrictions because that's what our laws say?
No, of course not. It's absolutely fine for different countries, different civilizations, different groups of people to organize and have different rules for how they want to live. I think that's totally fine. What we worry about here is at Davos is people saying, oh, this is what we do in our country, and thus, and we're an elite Western successful democracy. This should be exported everywhere. This should be the standard for everyone. I mean, that's what she said, sort of said at least, in that conversation we played from Davos, where she's saying, I bet hate speech laws will be coming to you.
Yeah, I mean, it sounded to me, and again, I don't have a dog in this fight, but it sounded to me like she was just saying it seems like there are growing concerns around misinformation in the United States, which is obviously true, particularly among the people from America who are talking at Davos. And maybe they've given her the indication that there's a growing appetite for hate speech laws, expanding hate speech laws, which at various times in history, there is always an appetite for expanding those kind of laws. Now, I don't know how much that is actually likely. In fact, the laws that we have seen being promulgated right now in the last few weeks of 2023 include a number of extremely authoritarian laws that I spoke about on my radar last week, including a ban on wearing what you want in drag, wearing drag, point blank period, the banning of a number of books.
Such a ban that, by the way, would not survive a legal challenge on First Amendment grounds.
Yeah, but it still is the case that, conservatives across the country are promulgating these extremely authoritarian laws. There's a ban on all of these books in Florida. I talked to a math professor, a math teacher on my show last night. He said it affected him. And I said, why? It's math books. He said, I don't know, but there's 45 books that we've been told, maybe it was 55 books that we've been told we can't use anymore. So, I mean, I don't know. I sometimes think that we're overly rosy about what the First Amendment is actually doing for us. It is a stop. It is a backstop, that it's an important one. But it doesn't mean that these people aren't right. There are definitely anti-speech authoritarian impulses happening in this country, both from people who would want to make hate speech illegal and people who would want to make, I don't know, me wearing pants illegal.
Okay, but they can sue. Like, the First Amendment does protect that. At the end of the day, we're better off with that. Also, to your point about having different policies. So obviously, I'm not an expert in the European Union and how it is formed and how people get the position in there and to what extent it's democratically representative of what the people think. I know that there are European conservatives, including the whole Brexit movement, right, that had criticisms of how decisions are reached under the European Union framework, whether that's actually representative of, I mean, this is a world government for Europe, right? Is it respective of the many different countries within its purview who have their own distinct histories and customs and rules? I don't know if the kinds of the ways the hate speech law is applied. I mean, in Britain, the hate speech law has been applied to arrest and ticket people for posting rap lyrics on Facebook.
Yeah, there was that incident during the Queen's funeral where people were followed for holding up signs that were critical of Prince Andrew. I mean, it's wild stuff. It certainly doesn't pass muster here.
Very wild. Yeah, not even close. What I'm saying is, I don't even know if the people agree with that. If this is a European Union dictate, is it just the elites getting together at Davos and they have these jobs that aren't particularly democratically accountable? They're more like the workings of our inner deeps, our federal official, our bureaucrats, and they're coming up with these policies, and they're not constrained because they don't have a First Amendment, and they're not really accountable either.
My impression of things is that it's a mixed bag, the same way that we feel like the fact of us having free speech here, having the First Amendment here, means that there's some bad outcomes that we don't like, but we live with because we think it's all for the better and the balance. We don't like Nazis walking through the streets, but we accept it because that's the price of freedom. I think on the other side, there are moments that are too restricted that people don't like, but they think on balance it's good because it's worth the price of not having Nazis march in the street. Again, in this Brazilian context, the guest I was talking to, Andrew Fishman, who is the head of the Intercept Brazil, he's an American, but he's been living there for like 10 or 15 years, speaks Portuguese, and he was saying, yeah, I have an American sensibility. But I also realized that we live in a country that very recently just got out of a military coup. There are rules in place to prevent the military, which is not as independent as the American military is, from undermining democracy. You can't post things that encourage there to be a military coup and saying things like this. Racism is illegal here, and it is. I understand why these laws are in place, given this political context, as compared to the American one, where we haven't really ever gone through that kind of a political moment. And the Intercept Brazil, it has gone through a lot of censorship and attacks on speech. It has been a real bête noire of the media infrastructure in Brazil, and it has had to live with the consequences of that. But even that being the case, he was like, look, I get it. He wasn't making an argument for one side or another, but I think that we are all a little naive about the negative implications about whatever regime that we choose for ourselves. And it was interesting to have this conversation where someone was willing to say, look, there are downsides, and you just basically have to decide what point from which you want to start arguing. What point do you want people to have to sue from, this side or that side?
I mean, it's not just our principles, though, right, that causes liberal-minded people to support free speech in the First Amendment. Also an idea, maybe an unproven, maybe people disagree with this, but an idea that not suppressing even toxic ideology, that suppressing them makes them more attractive to certain people and can backfire and doesn't, that you can't stop this even very dangerous Nazism. Like, you can't stamp it out by making it illegal, by making it forbidden. You actually draw people to it, or you make it seem like it's being persecuted and it's being there. Well, if people are so afraid of us, why? Or if we're so crazy, why won't they let us speak? Why are they afraid that you might hear what we have to say? And it totally backfires. And so that actually allowing that is a healthy way to operate in a liberal society.
I'm generally moved by that argument, but the counter argument that people bring up, it's worth noting, is that there have been these instances of people who have been disappeared from social media. Again, I'm not advocating for this, but there are people who have basically been truly canceled from social media, not just performatively, oh, I quit my job at a university and now I'm going to start a Substack. No, like actually fired and limited on social media, who have largely just left the public consciousness because they haven't been able to find an alternative audience. Even Donald Trump, for all that he's still obviously a major political figure, had, I think, a significant dent to his social relevancy after he was kicked off of Twitter. People like Milo Yiannopoulos, when they were canceled by their own community years ago, largely just completely disappeared because they weren't on social media, and also even Breitbart and the Republicans weren't trying to talk to him anymore.
I think that's a mixed bag, because attempts to stop him from speaking at universities was his whole shtick.
Right. I completely agree. So that's what I say. I generally speaking, am moved by the argument that censorship as a whole doesn't get to the root of the problem that you have. Like Milo Yiannopoulos' actually belief system. But there are these counterexamples that I think are worth paying attention to.
Well, we got to leave it there. We'll have more Rising right after this.